Hi, everyone. Welcome to The Heart of It, where we talk all things family life from a Christ-centered and Orthodox perspective. I'm so incredibly excited. This is our inaugural episode, and we have none other than our very own Archdeacon Mark Soliman with us. So welcome, Archie.
Thank you very much.
And Archie, you have such a heart for spiritual development and formation, and especially for the next generation to really have a sense of faith ownership and to know God in a real and intimate way. And so I'm just especially excited to be having this conversation with you. And so maybe tell us a little bit about the Rediscover I Am ministry, which is a part of this broadcast and all the things that we're trying to do with that.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's a blessing and honor to be here in the very first episode. Yep. The Rediscover I Am is basically the brand of the Department of Church and Culture. So His Eminence Metropolitan Serapion started this department in the diocese maybe about a year ago, a little bit over a year now. And the goal of the department is to try to bridge this gap between faith and culture. And in his words, what we're trying to do is be very Orthodox and very American at the same time. So we're looking for opportunities to help the parish churches and help the parish priests target some of the things that cause some of this division and some of the difficulties that come up between as we try to integrate into this new culture as a group of immigrants, basically. Mm-hmm. And of course, one of the things that comes first and foremost to mind is parenting and family and relationships. Actually, His Eminence, in his when he was coronated, in his inaugural sermon in 1995, which I attended, one of the things he said was, "Strong families make for strong churches." Mm. And I remember hearing him say that. And I was, a wee lad. I was only 25 then.
A wee lad.
Yeah, and okay. And I was like, wow, that's very insightful, and he's spot on. Yeah. And so to that end, this is one of the ways we're going to try to help, because obviously parenting in Egypt or even parenting in the United States in the 1980s was different than it is now, and so we have so many unique and difficult challenges as parents, and just trying to navigate, what to do. With all the stresses of life and job and all the responsibilities we have is tough. So that's what this whole ministry is about, is trying to figure these things out. So obviously parenting is one of the ways we're trying to do that.
I love that. Even the perspective of strong families and that being the core and the foundation, I think rings so true to what we're trying to do. And I think why when we see this work being done, it is so impactful, because you almost see the trickle effect of it starting at home. And so maybe before we dive into our content, I was wondering if you'd answer one fun question for us. And this is a would you rather question. And so if you had to choose between going to meet your ancestors 3 generations back, so your great, great, great ancestors, or your great, great, great grandchildren, what would you rather do?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. I think I would meet my great-great-great-grandchildren, because I guess I have a sense of what my great-great-great-grandfathers looked like, but I'm very curious to see what their world would look like in, 150 years or whatever it is. Yeah. So, and I'd want them to get to meet their old man, the old dead man by that point. So I think that's what I would that's what I'd pick.
I'm with you too. I think I want to know what I'm doing and if it has any impact, maybe generations down.
Yeah, I met this great servant. I won't say his name, but he's just one of these legend men, and he has 3 amazing boys, and each one is an amazing servant, and the 3 boys are my age. And I was talking with him about family, and he came to our family retreat when I lived in Seattle, and he said something to me that really stuck with me. He says, the true measure of a dad isn't how well your kids turn out. It's how well your grandkids turn out. Oof, and it's like he set a very high bar for himself. And he's like, if you want to see if you really did it, did you really instill it in them, is whether or not they give it to their kids or not just whether or not they, end up going to church. So that was quite a impactful statement for me. So
I think that's like a perfect segue into our topic for today, which is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I know to so many parents, which is how to help your children thrive spiritually, and to have a relationship with God that stands the test of time, that's real, that's intimate, that's engaged with their world and their friends and all the pieces that matter in life. And so, maybe I'll start off on a personal note. If there's been any spiritual disciplines or rituals in your life that have been impactful and meaningful and that have been a part of your faith formation over time?
Personally or with my family?
Well, actually both. I'd love to hear both.
I mean, personally, I think it was, my father in confession, Abu Antonius Hanin was very, very impactful for me because he was truly my spiritual father, and he literally gave birth to me spiritually, and he was just always there, always honest, always loving, and he truly just mirrored fatherhood as God would be. And so constantly that compassion and that love and that wisdom, and just very honest with me, always honest. And I would, call him out and yell at him for things and all kinds of stuff and things I didn't like. And he would, and when I was right, he would just say, "You're right. We shouldn't do that." And instead of just trying to defend it blindly and push back on a bad position. And so I learned a lot about fatherhood from him because he wouldn't push a bad position. When I had him cornered on something, and I'm like, we do this at church and we shouldn't, and he'd be like, "Yeah, you're right. We shouldn't. I don't know why we do that." And he would just acquiesce. And then I would calm down. Yeah. And then I would accept it. And he says, but this is just what our practice is. And this is how we've been doing it. And so, yeah, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but this is, and I'd be okay with that all of a sudden because he had not pushed on the bad position. So,
yeah, that openness.
Yes, right. Yeah. And then you feel seen, you feel heard, you feel validated. Yeah. And from there, now we have a relationship, right? And now we can give and take and we can talk, and I'll accept a lot more things after that. So that, I think for me, that was a big part of my own spiritual formation. Yeah. What was the other question?
The family piece, because you had mentioned if it was personal or in family life.
Yeah, I mean the family piece is somewhat easier at some level because really all you have to do is try to walk the walk, and you don't really have to emphasize it or point it out to your kids or drill it into them. They just absorb it. I'll use an Arabic expression. Bunadud Lamai always says, el tarbiyat tshirib, which just means discipline is absorbed by the kids. Yeah. So they're just going to kind of turn out like you regardless, right? Just like we all turn out like our parents. They turn out like you. So you don't have to worry about, am I sending the right message? Am I giving the right example? Am I doing the right, you just do and you be. And then you find that the kids just sort of do it. Sure. I'll share a story once, my son was like 7 or 8 years old, and he was, quite young. And we had this room in our old house as a prayer room. And we had just kind of found this room by accident. We just covered it in icons, and that was our place where, we would go pray. And I had a kind of an issue in the service that I was grappling with. And so I went in there and I was by myself. I went in there and I just kind of did a prostration. I was praying just in a prostrated, position. I didn't think anybody was actually home. And then I was there for a while, and then I got up and I looked, and my 8-year-old was next to me, also prostrated. He just imitated me, and had I tried to fabricate that situation, like, hey, watch dad pray, it's just not, he just saw me go in there and he just was attracted to that. And that probably is more impactful lesson on prayer than anything I could have said or most Sunday school lessons or anything else. So, as a parent, again, I don't encourage you to do anything so your kids see you. Don't go, we go to church so the kids can go to church. No, you go to church so you can go to church. Yeah. You pray so you can pray. Yeah. And don't worry about what they see and what they don't see. Let God take care of that piece. He'll give them the experiences they need, but you got to give the raw materials.
I love that. I think it speaks to faith being caught and not just taught, which is, I think, what we all hope and pray is what our life is speaking to in terms of our faith. And I think it's a really good segue maybe to the early pieces of what we're called to do in our parenting. We have this really beautiful imagery in Psalm 1 of a tree that's planted by the stream. You know, if we can imagine each child as that tree, what are some of the things that we should be instilling early on in our parenting that's going to have that long-lasting effect, do you think, in terms of their faith formation?
You know, I would be trying to instill everything that God is in my own life and my own parenting. So I would think about how merciful and forgiving God is, and then I would try to be that merciful and that forgiving. I think about how patient God is with me, and then I would try to be that patient with my children. You know, I always advise dads, you know, whenever they ask me, you know, any advice on, you know, what parenting advice. And the simple one line I give is, imagine what the father in the story of the prodigal son would do, and do that. You know, if you're at a loss and you don't know what to do, imagine what that guy would do and do what he would do, because he's the father, and that story is the quintessential look into what the heart of God looks like. You know, it's kind of this ridiculous, crazy love, overly patient, possibly enabling, you know, and excessively loving. You know, it's almost too much, right? And it kind of reminds me of, you know, what Elder Porphyrius's book, you know, Wounded by Love would look like, right? Where your children are wounded by your love. And so they it's like a tractor beam. They just can't resist it. And it always brings them back.
Sure.
You know, even in that story, what brought that son back was he remembered his father's house, you know, and so when the house is this place that's full of peace and patience and nice, you know, a safe place for them to come home, they want to go back, right? And if the church is that same safe place, they want to go back. So when the kids remember a fun, healthy, safe place, that endears them to you, and that endears them to your religion, your God, and they start to see who God is through you and that house that you've created.
Yeah. Well, and I think you're speaking to that piece of starting with who God is and that extravagant love, and where some of us sometimes get into this place of starting with the rules or the boundaries. And can you speak to that piece a little bit of you know, what that tension is of when we start there instead of who God is?
For sure. I mean, you know, everything has to be age appropriate, right? When you have a little kid, you know, who wants to drink, you know, a 2-liter bottle of soda, you don't say, well, you know, God would let you. You know, I mean, obviously you have to impose limits and discipline. And that's sort of our nature as parents, right? I mean, we are all kind of overboard on the rules in the beginning. And the hard part for a parent isn't imposing rules and discipline. That actually comes quite naturally. The hard part is reversing that, right? To start to see my child who's now 8 and not treat him like he's 6.
Sure.
And there's a difference between 8 and 6. And so I can't treat him like he was 6 anymore. And so as parents, what I think we should always be doing is we're always pushing for independence. We always want them to be self-sufficient, healthy adults. That's the bogey. That's the target that we're looking for. And so we should be always moving towards that goal, always be moving towards independence of the child and having them make their own decisions and asking them questions. And, you know, oftentimes when my kids ask me for my opinion, I often just repeat, well, what do you think? You know, and they'll be like, well, I think this, but like, what do you think? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I'm not the one who's dealing with the situation. You are. And, you know, sometimes I get to the point where they get frustrated with me, like, why don't you tell me what you think? You know, and I think sometimes we're on the opposite. You know, we're always telling our kids what they think. They tune us out. They don't care what we think. They don't want to listen to it anymore. They're sick of us. And we're just shoving it down their throats. And it would be wonderful if you got them to the place where they're asking you for what you think, right? And relishing and really, you know, engaging with those thoughts. So I think that would be my advice is like let's push towards that independence and we do that right when a kid starts walking, you know. We don't just carry them, right? We let them stumble and we hold their hands lightly. We don't always grab their hands, and we want them to go over uneven surfaces because we want them to trip every once in a while and know what that looks like. That's okay, you know. And so as parents, it's hard to continue that, right? Into high school, into college. You know, really, you know, when you have a college age student, you're just trying to, you know, just like you did when he was 1, you're trying to make sure he doesn't hit and hit his head on glass, right? If he falls and hits, that's the only thing if he wants to fall on his bum, no problem, right?
Yeah.
Falls on a knee, scrapes a knee, no problem. But just don't hit head on glass, right? And a college student's the same way. He can fall, he can mess up, he can make his mistakes. That's okay. That's how he learns, right? And not to get too crazy and caught up with the mistakes. Yep. Kids make mistakes. Kids do dumb things all the time. We did dumb things all the time. I mean, I didn't, but the rest of us did.
Definitely not me.
Yeah. Of course, right? So let him, and don't get all crazy about it and overblown and, oh my gosh, my kid doesn't. Let them, and then show them God's patience and God's love and God's forgiveness. And then let them just feel like they want to come rushing back to you, because this is the place where the safety is.
Yeah.
Right?
It's really this idea of like holding them closely but loosely at the same time. And, this was going to be something we were going to get later, but maybe it's a good time to speak to it now, because we're talking about that piece of God's love being so foundational and key in the beginning, and it's harder to add that in, right? If that's not where we start. So how should our conversations around faith change as our children are developing and as we're seeing them mature, and maybe we're not as hands-on, we're giving pieces of the autonomy back to them?
I mean, I think it's all going to be very age specific. And I always lean towards talking to my kids like adults as soon as possible. Honestly, when I give a Sunday school lesson to 8th graders or college students, I almost give it at the same level. And it's amazing, because often I'll give it to 8th graders and the servant will be like, they never sit that still and it's because I talk to them like adults. I recently had an experience where I talked to a bunch of 8th graders about a very sensitive topic, and all the parents warned me they're going to squirm around, they're going to joke around, these boys are blah blah blah, and they were just quiet, because I told them, I'm going to treat you like an adult, and I want you to act like an adult and respect me like an adult, and they did. So kids can really step up when you treat them that way. It's just hard as a parent to do that, right? Because I only see my little kid in diapers, I see them screwing up. I see them as incapable, unable to take care of themselves, unable to feed themselves. That's what I remember, right? So treating them like an adult is very difficult. And so you got to push yourself to do that, right? Doesn't come naturally, because as a parent, right, you've controlled every aspect of their life. You've controlled what they ate, what they drank, what color cup they had, what onesie they wore, when they changed their diapers, what diaper brand they used, what cream they use. I mean, you control every part of them. And all of a sudden at 6, 7, 8, they're like, hey, I want some control. And you're like, whoa. I've made, 3,000 decisions a year about, over you. And they've all been mine.
Yes.
And you can't have any of them, and so it's hard to pull away a little bit, let them pull away.
And I think what you're also speaking to is how we see ourselves as parents. If I'm not the decision maker anymore, if I don't have that level of, we'll call it control. Then who am I? Right? Like, who am I as a parent?
What's my identity?
Yeah. If I'm not the one, navigating and hovering and, directing each step.
Yeah. And I'm frankly not a big fan. There's a lot of guilt that comes along with parenting already. We all feel like we're bad parents. We haven't done a great job, blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden someone comes along and says, your kid's salvation is your responsibility. They're tied around your neck. Have you brought them to every single meeting at church? Have you done every, and it's like, I'm not a big fan of that kind of guilt. I mean, at some level, the kid's responsible for themselves, right? Their own salvation. I mean, there's my uncle, Abu Antonio Sunen, used to tell me back in Mansoura, back in the 1950s, when a child turned 12, they had this little ceremony where they would take him in front of the altar and they would sort of relinquish the raising of the child to the church at some level or to God. And I like that because, then the parent can relax a little bit and say, your relationship with God is yours. It's not mine. I don't go to hell if you go to hell. And some parents carry that. Like, what if my kid, then I will be judged and I will go to hell because, and so now they're operating from a position of fear
Sure.
of God, because God's going to punish me if this kid messes up. So I got to stop this kid from messing up, or I go to hell.
Yeah.
And now it's just it's bad theology.
Yeah.
It's wrong. And now it's just bad parenting.
Sure.
Because it's all fear-based.
Yep.
And now you're acting crazy with your kid because you don't want to go to hell because God's going to, and now the kid's like, what's wrong with dad? Why is he screaming like that over something silly,
And you never get to the faith ownership piece.
Exactly.
Where we see a lot of youth transition into adulthood.
Exactly.
And they don't know what belongs to them anymore in terms of their relationship with God or their identity.
Right.
As Christians, as children of God. So, something as simple as even like, I know I was, I'm not always certain like what my children are capable of until all of a sudden, like you just don't have a choice. And I was really sick one time and my son, I think, was asking for a sandwich or something. I was like, okay, like figure it out. He was really tiny. Well, this kid went into the fridge, got the meat, got the cheese, got the bread, put it all together, put it all back. And I don't think I would have known that he was capable of doing that until you're kind of like faced with needing it to happen. But it's sad that we don't allow our children to do that, even in their spiritual life, that we're not giving them the chance to wrestle just a little bit, even with what can sometimes feel scary for us as parents. And maybe speak to that piece a little bit about, addressing doubts and addressing areas where maybe we panic a little bit as parents. We don't want our children to have to, deal with what can feel like a faith crisis or something that, at least on the outside looking in, feels a little scary.
Yeah. I mean, our reaction to our kids' doubts is really important because they learn about, they figure us out from that reaction, and they figure out how much of an argument they actually have from that reaction. So, when I don't keep telling stories of my kids, but like when my son was like in 8th grade, he came up to me and he's like, I don't know if I believe in God anymore because we learned about evolution in school, and the teacher said that's where the creation comes from, and it's not the creation story because that's not scientifically based. Yeah. And of course, my heart just dropped, right? This is 8th grade. Yeah. I was expecting it in high school or something. Yeah. And I wasn't ready for this conversation. I still remember where I was, when this conversation happened. Yeah. And I just had to take a really deep breath, and I could have easily overreacted, fear-based. Oh my God, my kid is now going to become an atheist. The school, I'm pulling him out of the school. I'm going to that biology teacher. I'm going to cuss her out. Yeah. I'm going to go into the classroom. I'm going to embarrass him, and let me go. I'm going to have a parent-teacher conference. And if I had made a big ruckus about it, he would have seen me overreact out of fear, and then would have said, oh, you know what, Dad? No, never mind. No, I'm fine. Right? Because that means I can't talk to Dad about this stuff. Dad's kind of crazy about this stuff. He's going to embarrass me in front of my friends. So, you know what? No, Dad, I'm fine. And then that just sits there. Yeah. And then he would have, thought, like, why is Dad so scared? Sure. Like, if this is nothing, why are you scared? And kids learn a lot from watching us react, right? When we, you get a flat tire and you start screaming, like, oh my God, we have a flat tire. And the kid's like, versus, oh, we have a flat tire. Let's just pull over to the side of the road. And then they know this isn't a big deal because they watched you. So if I had overreacted, or if we overreact, the kid's like, oh, there must be something to this. Sure. Dad's scared of this evolution stuff, right? But instead I was very relaxed, and I was like, oh, you're talking about like survival of the fittest and natural selection. And he's like, yeah, oh, you know about that stuff. I'm like, oh, of course, yeah, all that stuff makes perfect sense, and sure, the bird with the good beak eats and the bird with the bad beak dies, and no problem, right? Sure. And when he saw me very calm and he saw that I knew some of this stuff, and but then I told him, but that doesn't mean there is no God, right? And in fact, the scientific method, he goes, oh, you know about that too? And I'm like, yes, of course. And that can't actually disprove God. Sure. And it's a misuse of it to just try to disprove God. And I talked about some of these things. Then he saw me just kind of calm, and I had reconciled my faith with it. Sure. I learned about it, and he just kind of moved along. Yep. Had I had this overly blown fear-based reaction, it would have ended very differently. So kids have doubts. Yep. The saints had doubts, right? And you read about many saints who struggle with their faith. These are saints.
Yep.
So we all have these arid times in our life, and it's okay to even share with your kid, yeah, I had a doubt too, and there was a time when I doubted God existed. And then they'll just feel so much more relaxed and in that revelation and go, oh, you doubted. Oh, okay. Then this is normal. And as opposed to attacking them and saying, we shouldn't say these things. Don't ever say that again. No, Christians don't say stuff like that. After all we've done for you and after we raised you in the church, this is how you repay us. And blah, blah, blah. And then you're going down this road and the kid's like, whoa, okay. I won't talk to you anymore. Don't worry. Wait till I'm 22 and I'll leave the church.
Sure.
And that'll be our deal, right? And so, anyway, that's...
No. Well, and all you've done is close a door, right then and there. And there's so many things to what you just shared. I think one is just like practicing our poker face sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
As parents is taking that minute to really just assess, like, what am I trying to communicate here, even when we don't have all the pieces figured out. So you shared something really key and critical is that you had reconciled your faith. You had done that work. And so what could have felt really big and overwhelming didn't, because there was some spiritual discipline, there was some practice, there was some awareness on your part. Can you speak a little bit on what we need to do as parents? Not that we're going to be prepared for every question or everything that comes our way. There's just, given what our children see and how our culture is constantly changing, like there's just no way. But what can we do as parents to be prepared to acknowledge the role of our own self-awareness, of our own work as we parent?
I mean, I think the primary thing I'd suggest is, don't settle. Don't settle as a parent for these canned answers that never satisfied you when you were young, right? We all got these answers. I remember just hearing these answers and thinking, that didn't make sense. Yeah. And then just not doing anything about that for a couple of decades. And then now your kid asks you and you're like, well, this is what I heard. Yeah. And they're looking at you like, well, that's dumb. And you're like, yeah, it is dumb. I don't know what to say other than that, right? So I would say, go back and push yourself, right? Like learn about your own faith. And if something doesn't sit well with you, and, go back, remember when you were a teenager, go talk to Abuna, go talk to a servant and say, this never made sense to me. And so before I have kids, can you talk me through this, and I find myself talking to people in their 40s now, who are just like working through the stuff they heard when they're 16, and they're like, I'd heard this thing and it's still eating away at them 30 years later. And as soon as they say it, I go, yeah, that doesn't make any sense. They're like, you're right. It doesn't make any sense. And so we kind of talk through the correct Orthodox theology, which does make sense, right? And so the church has nothing to hide, right? We have no fear. We have nothing that scares us. There is no question that scares us ever. And we encourage all our kids to ask questions. If I don't know the answer, I'll get you an answer. We'll find an answer. I'm not worried about any question anybody could pose to me, right? And so when we have that confidence ourselves, right, and we get that by asking people the tough questions, right? And let loose, and don't be embarrassed that you're 40 and you're still asking the third grade question that you never got a good answer to. Ask that question and hope for a better answer, right? Unfortunately, sometimes you've asked a parent or a sibling or a friend at school or a Sunday school teacher, and they didn't have a good answer, so they just kind of made something up, which seems to be our MO, right? And so don't do that. Don't perpetuate the cycle of bad answers.
And I think it's so powerful what you're sharing is that we're modeling there's something to the process, to the journey, and that the calling isn't to know it all, to get it all, but that there's intention, that there's heart, there's openness in having those conversations. And I think kids sense that. They sense that in us, if we're willing to go into those hard places with them. And, this is maybe a good place to transition into what you see are some of those challenges. And this is kind of a big question, but throughout the different stages, what are those spiritual challenges? How do they evolve over time, whether that's in your own personal life, raising your kiddos? I know they're, launched into adulthood now, or what you've seen in ministry. And how can parents navigate how those spiritual challenges shift over time?
Well, I'll say something kind of unpopular now. The spiritual challenges are usually your fault as a parent. What's going to happen is they're going to pick up on some weakness or some brokenness in you, which we all have, no doubt, some weakness or some brokenness in you, and then that's where Satan will enter into the family and into the and they'll reflect something you have, a disease or some issue you have, whether it be pride, you don't admit when you're wrong, you have you lie a lot. They're going to see something, and then that's how it's going to enter. And because it's your weakness, and you haven't fought the good fight yet, or you haven't tackled it head on yet, you'll find that your reaction will be quite aggressive, right? Because you'll see, that ugliness, your ugliness in your kids, which we've all experienced, which is the worst feeling ever, right? When
100%.
you see your kid doing something lame, and you're like, he got that from me, right? That's always lovely, but
and in public, that's always the funnest part.
And then if you say something, they're like, "Well, that's what you do, Dad." I'm like, "Oh boy, okay, let's go inside." So then your reaction won't be good either, right? Because you'll know it's coming from. So then the way to fix that is it's repentance, right? And I'm not saying run to the priest at that moment, but repent to your child first, and start with, okay, I know where you got that. I know Daddy does that. I know Mommy does that. I shouldn't do that, right? Can we work on this together and not do those things, right? And I would love it if when I do something that you think is you tell me and say, Dad, you're getting angry again, or Mommy, you're being whatever again, and let's work on this together, right? And show them that, like you said, it's a spiritual journey. We're all on the spiritual journey. I don't have the answers. Often when I'm cornered, in a meeting and some kid asks me a really hard question, which occasionally they do, I always start with, I have no idea, and everyone laughs. And then I'll kind of reason through. I'll say, well, the Bible tells us this, and one of the fathers said that, but I don't understand this part. And why God would do this, I don't know either, because I'm not God. And just kind of work through a very calm process for how I would reconcile to that answer. If we do that with our kids, and not be know-it-alls, and not be constantly, almost belittling and degrading them in our knowledge, let them teach you, ask them questions, try to get more out of them. Well, you're really good at this. I'm not good at this. Build their confidence and let them know this is a two-way relationship, right? And that's ultimately where all this falls down, is because if my relationship with God isn't a relationship, it's a series of ritualistic actions to this all-knowing, mighty God who, I'm scared of, and I got to do all these things to appease this God so he doesn't hurt me. If that's my relationship, well then, I don't know how. So then my relationship with my kids will be sort of the same way, And so the more I can engage in relationship with God, the more I can engage in relationship, which is a two-way thing with my kids. And then they sense my humanity, my struggle, my weakness. I'm not perfect, and we're all in this together.
And that's incredibly convicting, but there's almost no other way to do it. I was talking to someone not too long ago who grew up with a very strict father. And everything was about the rules and how you had to manage your relationship with God in that way. And, unfortunately, his father had passed away, and they were cleaning his garage, and they found wads of gambling, lottery tickets. And gambling was like a big no-no in their house. And it just pierced his heart to hear, throughout his childhood, all the rules that then maybe weren't real for his fatherhood. And I think that hypocrisy, which all of us have, it's not to speak to having something that, some other parents haven't figured out. But I think that's really scary, is that our children see something in us where we walk the talk in some areas, but not in where it really matters for our children's hearts. And so can you speak a little bit about, where that conviction ought to take us as parents?
Yeah, I mean, so in that example, it's perfect, right? It's because the dad's compensating for his own weaknesses, right? And lots of parents do this, right? I was never a good athlete in high school, so I push my kid to be the star athlete I never was, right? I never made the quarterback. I'm going to make him be a quarterback. So obviously this dad was broken on this one level, right? And so he's like, I'm going to make sure, and you'll see this, like, the parent that's totally against alcohol and don't you ever take a drink. He's got bottles in the back, and he's just trying to keep his son or daughter from doing the same mistake. So, the solution isn't harp on my kid, right, and make them better and make them. The solution is to fix me, and go back. There's this wonderful story with Father Matthew the Poor, and this woman came up to him, and she said, my daughter, and this is back in the 60s, my daughter is living a very promiscuous life. She dresses very, poorly. She goes out to the clubs at night. She goes dancing with boys. She does all the bad things, and she's living this, she doesn't go to church, blah, 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 and just listed this whole thing about her 22-year-old or whatever daughter. So Abuna looked at her and he goes, okay, all right, here's what we're going to do. Who's your father in confession? And she said, I don't have one. He goes, first thing you do, you're going to get a father in confession. And what's your prayer rule? I don't have one. Here's your prayer rule. What's your Bible reading? Here it is. What's your spiritual time? Here it is. What's your meditation time? Here it is. And he gave her all these rules. And at some point she goes, Abuna, did you misunderstand me? I'm talking about my daughter. I'm not talking about me. He goes, okay, I'm glad you brought that up. You're not allowed to speak to your daughter anymore. Don't speak to her for 6 months. And what you're going to do is all of these things, and you must do all of these things. 1 hour of quiet meditation time, spiritual time. You have to read. You have to do this. And she's like, what about my daughter? Like, don't even talk to her. Don't even acknowledge her existence. Leave the food out on the counter. Let her feed herself. Wow. So she did this, and she started changing her life. Yeah. And the story goes that the daughter would knock on her door while she's in her spiritual time, and mom would not answer, say, I'm in my spiritual time. Yeah. Eventually, the daughter breaks down her door at some point at the end of this and says, Mom, I don't know what it is, but I want to be like you now. Wow. Right? Mm-hmm. And so Abuna was wise enough to realize the problem wasn't the daughter, it was mom, right? Yeah. So fix mom, the daughter comes right around. Yep. So instead of this guy burying his gambling habit and then repressing his kids. Yeah. We all do this, right? Sure. We all have our own hang-ups, and then we take it to the kids. Yeah. Fix me, start with me, and then it naturally just kind of flows. Yeah. This peace that you have with God and this spirit you have will flow to the kids, and they'll feel it. Yep,
and not to push back on this, because it's 100%. Right, it hits the mark on every level. I'm curious for you if you notice that there's either temperament or our children's own sinfulness or their own weaknesses, and how that interacts with maybe a parent who, by God's grace, is trying to do it God's way. Where do you see that tension, and where can parents then rest in knowing that they are doing it God's way, while their children might still be struggling and might still have some things to work out that, for what it's worth, aren't a parent's responsibility. Yeah.
Sure. I mean, look, especially when you have those, you have multiple kids, they're all different, right? And they all came out of the same womb, and they're raised in the same house, but each one's got their own set of quirks and their own, idiosyncratic, sins or whatever. Yep. The way I see it sometimes is, I wonder sometimes if God sends us these kids, not, they're the kids we need to perfect us. Sure. It may not even be this kid absorbed my sinfulness, and so he's reflecting my sinfulness, but he has a sin that I don't have and he didn't get from me, but really, really bothers me, And now I've got to learn how to control my own reaction to that, because that kid does that one thing that just drives me nuts. And now it's a patience game, right? So, so sometimes I feel like, I've even asked my kids, I have 3 kids, I asked them if they take turns trying to drive me crazy, each one.
They do. They have meetings the night before.
They must, right? It's like, oh, this week I will be the problem. Next week you got it. And then they just rest in between, and they tag each other in.
That's good of them.
It's, it shares the workload, right? Why should everyone?
Don't tax one individual.
That's right. Yeah. And each one has their own unique way of hurting me. Sure. So there's that too. But so I wonder sometimes if it's for me, and it's not something I gave my kid, but something I'm going to have to deal with and learn to and it's very hard, and and sometimes, kids are our path to perfection, as marriage is the path to salvation.
Yeah.
Kids are the next step, they perfect us further. And, getting married, you start to remove selfishness out of the system, right? You have to deal with another person and their own quirks. And then you add kids to the mix, and now you got to be even more selfless, right? And they continue that perfection process where it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. And I'm just giving. And then they become teenagers. And then after everything you've done and all the selflessness you've given, they turn to you and they say, hey, you're ruining my life, Dad. And you're like, okay, now there's no gratitude on top of it, right? So that's another level of perfection to the parent, right? Because, prior to that, sure, my kid was 8, he was driving me crazy, but when he scored a goal, that was for me, right? I was the proud dad. But when even that gets taken away from me, and the gratitude gets taken away from me, and now they don't even want to be around me, and they don't want to talk to me, and they don't like me. Now you've got to dig deeper, and remove even more selfishness out of the system.
I really appreciate that you're bringing it back to ourselves again, because at some point where our identity is rooted, when it's not, the 15-year-old who's, basking in our glory as parents, and where then we're left, either in our marriages, in our identity with Christ, in our communities. I think we don't talk enough about that piece of like who am I outside of a role that can sometimes feel really encompassing, at least, from like a mother's perspective. Talk more about that piece of our identity as, I don't want to say like individuals, but, as first and foremost a child of God, and then how that then pours into parenthood.
Yeah, this is the big crisis of our time, which is I identify as name the thing. And to me, this is just a delusion of Satan to have us identify ourselves as anything other than the Son of God. I don't even identify as a father, as an archdeacon, as an accountant, as a lawyer, as a doctor, as a son, as a daughter. I don't identify as any of those things, right? I have to focus my identity completely. I'm the Son of God, and that's it, right? And so everything that comes my way, whether it be my spouse or my children or my job or my service, that's just God. That's all a part of my relationship with God and how God is going to bring me closer to Him and perfect me, right? And, it's kind of like, the story of Job. You start with a very good man, but there's just something missing, right? And so God had to poke at that thing just a little bit till it came out. And then it did come out, and Job got really quite upset. And then he came around to me, I see children doing the same thing, right? You can be great and you've reached a level where you're like, okay, I'm pretty stable. And then that kid shows up and does that one thing that just drives you batty. And there we go. Now we got to dig deeper and become more perfected. And when my vision is clear, that my vision is, this is a relationship between me and God, and I'm His son first and foremost. And now I'm going to deal with this child in a way that my Father will, appreciate and be happy with. And I'm serving God and not my kid. I'm serving God and not my spouse. I'm serving God and not the priest or the whatever service I'm doing. I serve God first and foremost, even in my children, even in my spouse, with my spouse. Then that identity keeps everything kind of in harmony, right? Then I'm kind of just very focused on what's going on here. And I'm at 30,000 feet. I'm not in the weeds of this action or that action. It's more about how am I going to become a better person and deal with this in a more Christian, mature way.
And I think you're speaking to the overflow of that. If we start off from that peripheral place and then try to work our way back in, it can be really hard. And, what are some practical spiritual disciplines, practices that you see maybe some families doing that, are working well and are engaging their children in ways that are meaningful and real? And where's maybe some of our time wasted in like how we're pouring into what we think would be spiritually meaningful for our children. Like speak to that piece of it, like where our energy should be, at least, in terms of like family life, home dynamics, what we should be doing together as a family. So
I'll start with where we're wasting our time, and then I'll kind of go to where I think one of the places we waste our time a lot is activities.
Sure.
And we just run ourselves ragged. And even as kids, we weren't in 1/8 of these number of activities. And I had experience with my son that really just changed my whole perspective. I was taking him to baseball, and baseball is like 2-3 hour practices a week, and then a 4-hour game on Saturday. It's a lot of time. Okay, and I kind of owned the thing, and I was always taking him to practice, and I was just spending hours and hours and hours of this stuff. And I'm at every single practice. I'm there all the time, and I'm thinking I'm father of the year here, right? I'm coming home early. I'm taking him to 3-hour practice. I'm sitting there, and I bring him back, and I take him out to eat, and then we have a little bonding time at Carl's Jr. or whatever, right?
You splurged.
Yeah, I went crazy, right?
Yeah.
And I got him a shake, and then. And this is like 10 hours a week. Yeah. And then at one point, we were talking, and my son said, "Well, I mean, you don't ever spend time with me." And I was like, "What? Like, what about baseball?" He goes, "Well, no, baseball isn't time spent with me. I mean, you just drive me, and then you talk to the parents, on the sidelines, but you're not spending any time with me." Wow. I was like, "You don't think that's counts?" And he's like, "No." And I was blown away by that. I was like, holy moly, I've been wasting my time. My kid doesn't even count this stuff. And I'm counting it like double time. Yep. I'm like, people go to swim practices. They're sitting there, whatever the thing is. I was like, so you don't think that's us spending time? He's like, no. I'm like, done. Do you like baseball? He goes, no. I go, we're done.
Wow.
I pulled him out of baseball. Wow. And then every day I'd go throw the ball with him for 20 minutes in the street with our mitts on. And then I'd take him to the park. I'd hit the ball out to them. He'd catch the ball. And that 15 minutes a day was like gold to them.
Infinitely more.
Infinitely more than the 10 hours that I would spend a week. And then it got really ugly because, the coach, right? Now the coach is his son's on the team. The coach, of course, spends double the amount of time I spend, and he's thinking he's father of the century, right? Sure. I'm managing the whole team for my son. I'm the coach. I'm the hero, blah, blah, blah. My son was talking to his son, and he says, yeah, my dad throws the ball with me for like 10 minutes a day. And the son in front of his dad, the coach, goes, wow, you're so lucky. My dad doesn't spend any time with me like that. And I could just see the dad's face like, I put 30 hours a week into this, and my son's jealous of 10 minutes with his dad. Wow. Right. And so it really struck all of us as to, it was a really important lesson. So, I mean, I tell parents all the time, save it, don't waste your time running around. And you see all these, we're driving out to Barstow for this, this, soccer tournament. And we're going to sit there for, go kick the ball with your kid for 10 minutes and it will infinitely, so especially when they're younger, they just want that time. And I think we as parents get carried away with, if we get them into baseball early, then they'll make the high school team. And if we get them into this early, and you've got to, and it's like, most likely your kid isn't going to play college ball. Sure. And if he does or she does, it's really hard and will compromise their grades. So just, relax. As Egyptians, we're just not genetically,
we've got
athletes.
Other gifting.
We build pyramids. We don't, actually, we got other people to build them, I guess, because we're
good managerial roles.
We're good managers.
Yes.
As far as what to do with your kids, and I think this is a very hard question because there isn't an answer that works for everybody, of course, but it's very...
even that's a good place to start, knowing that...
Yeah, it's very person-specific, right? Because you got to do what's natural. So you don't want to do what I'm doing, right? Just because I'm doing it. Because I do it because it works for me. It may not work for you, When I started teaching, at university... we would sit in on these with these other professors, like the superstar professors, and they'd always tell us, don't try to imitate them. You have to find your own style. You just try to do what they do. It works for them because that's their shtick, right? So as a parent, don't just copy some other parent, right? It's got to be organic. It's got to come from the heart. Yeah. It's got to be natural. And if it's not natural, everybody can tell, right? Yeah. And, we tried lots of things growing up with the kids. Okay, we're going to have family Bible game night, right? I'm not a game person. Sure. I've never been a game person. Yeah. So that never went anywhere. Unfortunately, my wife is a game person, so that caused some tension, but that's not important.
Yeah.
We'll have another therapy session later. But so, everyone has to try, and an extension of their own spiritual life will, your cup runneth over, right? And so it'll flow into the kids as long as it's coming out of the heart. The thing that I found works for me is every time my kid pissed me off, I would go to the other room and I would pray. And just quietly, no one knew I did this.
Yes.
And I just say, God, you teach him, because obviously I'm failing. And honestly, and I don't want to share too many stories, but on more than one occasion, it was nothing short of miraculous what happens next. And it's almost like God's giving you a little, little shot in the arm, like, okay, I got this. Yeah. So that's what I did. Yeah. Every time the going got rough, I just closed my eyes, took a moment, said a prayer. Yeah. Sometimes the prayer was, take this kid. No, I'm kidding. But it has to be your thing, and don't try to be another parent. Don't try to imitate other parents. Whenever we see saints and we try to just imitate what a saint did. No. Imitate how much he loved God or she loved God, but don't imitate what they did, And
I think you're speaking to so many different aspects of this. The first being, being with our children, not just next to, when we're talking about activities and just the doing, of all the busyness and the noise and the distraction of life. And I think the other piece of really studying our children and knowing that there is intentionality behind why God has put this pairing together and our family dynamics and our constantly, like, there's actual thought. Like, God has put thought into this, and what works for one family might not be where your family's going to spiritually thrive. So I really love that perspective of stepping back and taking time to really settle in your soul, that there isn't some criteria for how it has to be done. And maybe speak a little about where some well-meaning parents can get things wrong in their spiritual efforts and attempts. Like some of it that sounds good, looks good, but again, isn't translating well, at least for how our children are navigating the worlds today.
The most dangerous thing, and it kind of alluded from our previous conversation, is comparing. Don't ever compare your kids. Don't compare them to each other within a family, and certainly don't compare outside. Don't compare how that wife is, treating her husband, and how come you don't treat me that way. That comparison is just the beginning of unhappiness in general. So don't look to other kids. These are my kids. These are the ones God's given me for whatever reason. And focus on them and see them for who they are. So I'd say that's the first thing. What was the other question you asked me?
Well, speak of all the pieces. I think some well-intentioned parents right, can get it wrong sometimes.
So I think the thing that I see the most is excessive strictness. And what that tends to yield is it just tends to yield a negative reaction, because there's just a natural revolt that happens when you're trying to be controlled too much.
Sure.
And so whenever you put a bunch of lines and a bunch of rules and a bunch of things, the whole game becomes beat the rules, right? How far can I get away with without triggering a consequence? How can I trick my parents into thinking I did this thing when I didn't? How can I fool them? And so the whole thing is, I've talked to youth who are giggling that they were able to hurt themselves and my parents don't even know. And you're like, why are you proud of that? And I even pointed it out to them, you've reached the point where you want to beat your parents so bad, they're trying to protect you from yourself, and you're still giddy at the thought of tricking them as you hurt yourself. And it's because because their parents have tried so hard to control them and manipulate them, guilt them, shame them, and really just in an almost evil way. Not evil, I shouldn't use the word evil, but
well, there's so much pressure that gets put on us and wanting to get it right, that it can take us to that fear-based shame approach very easily.
Then they weaponize God,
Yes.
right? And God's going to do this to you, and God's going to do that, and this happened to you because you didn't listen to me, and God's trying to punish you, and so that God just becomes this convenient tool as my stick, and God's going to do this to you if you don't listen, and stuff like that, and then just makes the kids hate God and hate the church, and many people have said atheism isn't about not believing in God. It's about hating God, right? Hating the God that was presented to you, the God that was weaponized against you, right? And then atheism becomes my revenge against God. Like, I'll show you, I won't believe in you, and then you'll go away, and I won't have to deal with this pressure that my parents have put in me about how God's watching and waiting for me to screw up and waiting for me to mess up. So a lot of well-intentioned parents just go too strict, using God as a weapon, really out of fear, sometimes out of comparison. Well, my kids, my brother's kids are, very well behaved, or they're doctors, or they're whatever, or they're super deacons, and I'm going to do that. And those aren't your kids, and you just have a different set. So that would be my main advice.
I that piece of the comparison, and then, where fear sometimes takes us in almost suffocating, what can feel like very normal kid reactions to failure, to not getting it right, that we can turn our whole family dynamics upside down because we want something so badly, but the way that we're getting there is working against us. And speak to a little bit about like the pressures that you see some of our youth either at school, at launching into adulthood, maybe even when they're tiny. What are some of those pressures that parents need to start paying attention to that maybe, again, unintentionally we're feeding into as we're trying to do it right?
I mean, right now, the number one pressure, especially as an immigrant community, that we all see is the pressure to succeed academically. I appreciate that, and of course, we want our kids to succeed academically, and sometimes they have to be pushed. But the pressure that the kids face now just to get into college is so hard, and the standards are going up all the time. The acceptance rates at some of these big schools, 3-4%. It's just craziness. And everyone's piling into the same universities. And so the parents realize this. They start the pressure like at, fourth grade. They make sure that you're in the right classes and the right teachers and the right track. And then, unfortunately, a lot of kids just kind of collapse. And so one of the things I see a lot, as a professor is, these kids come into undergrad and they got into USC and that's great and all this stuff. And once they get in, they're like, okay, I made it.
What now?
They did so much work to get into USC or UCLA or whatever. And, all these AP classes and this extra this and this extra that. And you're kind of like, oh, no, you're just starting. You didn't make nothing yet, right? And they're tired. They're already tired. And then they'll show up to college and they're like, it's time to blow off some steam. It's time to party. I'm here to enjoy it. And because they've put so much, into getting in, that they're exhausted and they want to just go crazy. So, and part of that, I think, is also this lack of, like you said earlier, a lack of allowing my kids to just be and to do for the right reason. Like a lot of kids don't want to learn. Like, as even as a college professor, we're seeing that the kids are dumber than ever, when they come in, yet their grades are better than ever. And it's because they don't want to learn. They just want to game the system. It's all about gaming the system. And so we haven't taught, you'll see the parents just say, okay, well, just put that down because that'll look good on your resume. And it's like, what? What are you teaching your child? That sentence. What are you teaching your child? Like, volunteer at church because it'll look good on your resume? Do you know how many mistakes you just made as a parent because your heart isn't in the right place? And so we have to be really careful that we don't create these people who are gaming church, gaming the schools, gaming the system, gaming friends. Tell your friend you did this for them so that they know you're a good friend. How about just be a good friend and accept that maybe not everyone will be a good friend back to you. And that's okay, because that's what happened to Jesus too. You know, and push on the deeper things, right? And so sometimes the parents inadvertently, in their effort to bulldoze for their kids or helicopter hover or whatever, they want to clear the way and they want them to succeed. But like failure is it's a much better teacher than success. Let them fail and teach them how to work through it. And you're only going to be able to do that is if you've worked through it, right? And, you know, all of these things are important to you on a deeper level than just, you know, do this so that, you know, Abuna notices you or Sayidna sees you or the servants know that you're, you know, helping out and make sure you send the email. And, you know, I mean, it's like, come on. So as parents, we have to be very careful what we teach the kids because the kids pick up on that hypocrisy pretty strongly.
And I think what you're speaking to really does translate very quickly then into our spiritual lives and seeing God as somebody who is measuring our outward performance. And it's hard to disconnect that if you know, the people who are in charge of my spiritual life, whether that's in church or at home, are measuring me in this way, then why wouldn't God measure me in that way?
Well, they're learning about who God is from you. And so if you're a measurer, right, and you're like, give me, give me some deliverables, then God's a deliverable guy as well. And everything we know about, you know, him from the Bible is he looks at the heart, not the deliverables. You know, so that's not it.
Okay, so this is asking for a friend. You know, I don't know, just for a friend. Our children are sometimes disengaged, disinterested in church, in, you know, what can feel like, you know, the quote unquote like things we have to do. So how do you talk to parents who are trying to engage their children and maybe at the various ages? I know we sometimes picture just the disinterested teen, and it's not always that. Sometimes it's the 5-year-old who doesn't get it yet. But how do we help parents, and how do you help me really, help our children either engage a little more, begin to see church services, like the things that we do to be with God and in community as things for them and not out of, again, obligation or that we owe God something by our presence there.
Yeah. I mean, St. John Chrysostom, you know, says if you're not talking to God all week, you know, you're not going to find him on Sunday. And I think that's very applicable to children too. You know, if faith is just a part of the weekly cycle of life, and I don't just mean, you know, religious rituals, right? But you know, true faith, talking about God, engaging him in conversation, and even things like icons and incense and candles in the house. You know, make the church, the home like the church, right? And so it's very familiar in both places. That's one of the ways I think that, you know, it's just kind of part of so that the Sunday becomes a cap, not like, you know, I've been go. It's been swim team and baseball and football and soccer and blah, 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 and piano and all these other things and Kumon and all this stuff, this secular stuff. Okay, quick. Let's do the church thing now, right? And let's check off those boxes and get off those measurables, you know, and knock that out. So that's the first thing. The other thing is, again, you know, you have to control your fear, right? Kids, you know, ebb and flow.
Sure.
And that's normal, right? And sometimes they'll have a good month and sometimes they'll have a bad month. And if you freak out at the bad month, then the good month gets harder, right? Because your reaction left a bad taste in their mouth, right? So, you know, they sometimes have some bad months and, you know, you kind of cajole them a little bit and you kind of kid around with them and maybe you kind of, you know, get them to come. And of course, you know, the most important thing is just you. You know, again, like a lot of times when you know, my kids are like, when are you going to church? I'll just tell them my time and then I'll leave. Right. And I'll even hear them getting ready, you know, and I'll just kind of leave. And I'll get a text, you know, when I get to church 5 minutes later, like, you know, why'd you leave me? You know, I'm like, well, you're late. I mean, there's next week. Don't worry. No big deal. Just come. And
that can feel really scary for some parents to have that approach, like to trust.
Right.
that
The thing is, though, the kid is, your child is going to learn about church attendance from your church attendance, not from your talk.
yeah
And forcing them and pushing them excessively isn't going to achieve your objective, right? And it is very scary, and there is a little bit of trust there, but the long-term effect of forcing just leaves a bad taste in their mouth and bitterness, and the long-term effect. I mean, as a parent, right, you really have to play the long game.
Yep.
You're always thinking about the long game, right? I mean, I can force my kid any Sunday to go to church, before Abuna shows up, and I win. And I look like a hero parent, right? Oh, wow, my kid was, there before everybody else.
Yeah.
But when they're 35, that's where I'm aiming. I'm aiming for my 35-year-old kid, not my 6-year-old kid,
Sure.
right? So I need to be building foundation, right? And so make church a pleasant experience, meet them where they're at, bring them coloring books. We used to bring icon coloring books, obviously, Bible coloring books. Don't shush them all the time. If you're in a place where everyone turns at you and shushes you and gives you dirty looks, find another place where people don't give you dirty looks, or just, I don't know, put your hand up in front of their face. Sometimes people feel the need to defend God and his house really, really badly.
From toddlers.
From toddlers, right?
Yeah.
Alexander Schmemann used to say that kids making noise in church was holy noise, and it was the sound of angels.
My kids made a lot of holy, still make a lot of holy noise.
Same, yeah. We got lots of stories we can tell there. But so, meet the children where they are. They're kids, right? And forcing them to sit through a 2-hour, 3-hour, shush fest, and then say, why don't you want to go to church? Another thing, as your kids get older, that a lot of parents make this mistake is they demonize the other people at church, right? They say, don't post stuff on Instagram because the people at church will see it and they'll talk about you, and people will talk badly about you, and people will judge you there, and people will, say all this stuff about you. Now go to church.
Yeah.
And you're like, why would I go to the place where all the dangerous people are? So you've scared them of all the people at church. You told them how bad they are, how judgmental they all are. And by the way, you're also judgmental with the other, girls and how they're dressed. And when you came home from church, you're like, I can't believe her mom let her wear that, and blah, 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 blah. So they're watching. They know what's happening when they come home.
Yep.
And you've created this place of fear.
Yeah.
And we all know that kids, especially in America, feel very judged and shamed and condemned at church.
Yep.
They get talked about, and then they stop coming.
Yep.
So don't create that environment. Don't you do the gossiping, and certainly don't demonize the people at church, or talk bad about the priest and say he's not doing a good job and he's whatever, and the deacons are whatever. And you talk bad about all these people, and you're just poisoning the well. This is the fountain of life, Let them come and see the beauty of the Eucharist, And when they do come and complain and say, oh, I can't believe, the Buna did this, or deacon did this, or this guy said this, but Jesus was there, right? And I connected with him today. Or come home and tell him a story of how today's liturgy was so amazing, and I felt God's presence in my life more today than I had last week. And just share with them the beauty, right? And be that bee that's attracted to the flowers and the honey, and not the fly that's attracted to trash and poop.
Yep. How do you transition from poop? There's this really lovely story that Father Tom Hopko shares about a convert who entered into the Orthodox faith, and he was talking about how the church was like an ark, and it is full of animals, and it smells, and it stinks, and all these things, and it'll save you. And I think sometimes we as parents struggle with that tension of how do we help our children engage with a church that's being perfected. There are things that we see because we are human, we are broken, all of us in whatever capacity we're serving in. That's why we need Jesus, why we need a savior. So how do we help our children engage with that brokenness, whether it's in our homes, in the church, without losing faith, without disconnecting God's presence in the midst of that brokenness?
Yeah. I mean, I love that story by Thomas Hopko. And I think the main way to do that is when they expect perfection, you have to let them know, well, you're in the wrong place. You know, the church isn't perfect, and the people in the church aren't perfect. And you know, like one of the dangerous things we sometimes do is sometimes we idolize, whether it be clergy or servants or whatever, and then as soon as that idol disappoints us, I can't believe, you know, this happened. And then the fall can be very large sometimes, and sometimes they'll just leave the church over these things. So, you know, my reaction is always like, well, who told you this person's perfect, right? And when you show this person grace at home, you know, they come home, they complain, and they're like, yeah, and you jump in, you say, I can't believe a priest would do such a thing, and I can't believe that, you know, this guy would do. Don't do that.
Yeah.
Right? Just humanize them and say, he's a man, he's a woman, she's a woman, they're struggling, she's trying. You know, I struggle too. You know, I remember I lost my temper last week, and I remember I judged somebody 2 weeks ago, and it turned out I was wrong. You know, again, share with them your own struggle. Let them know you're imperfect as well.
Yeah.
You know, and many times I've shared with my kids, you know, like, yeah, there's this person, and I judge them. It turns out they're really nice, and I'll tell them the whole thing. Like, I saw them when they had the blue hair, and I thought, you know, oh, what's this person doing here? And then where they are. And it turned out they're the nicest people, and let them know I made a mistake. And then they feel good when they make a mistake too. And they're like, there's hope for me. There's a path back, you know, and dad messed up and he came back. Mom messed up, she came back. I can come back. You know, it's not all lost. And and we're all broken. And the church, and I repeat it every talk, you know, the church is a hospital, right? And everyone in there is sick. And if they're not sick, they should go home. You know, so that's just their sickness. But I have this other sickness. And give them grace, because I hope people give me grace when I mess up too. So.
And I think that word and that key piece of grace, time and time again, you know, I think the minute we remove that from the equation, we remove God from the equation. I love that, at least as I see it, Archie, you're so open with, you know, what is age appropriate and how to communicate, whether through story, it's biblical, personal, the lives of the saints. You know, tell me a little bit about the role of storytelling in spiritual development and faith formation. Our church is so rich with stories that are real and poignant and powerful. So speak to how parents can use that in their child's spiritual development.
Well, the first thing is, as typical of me, is the parents need to learn those stories, and not learn them to learn them, but learn them and feel them. And so what I would say is, every time you hear a story that moves you, share it. Because it's going to come from the heart. If you're just going to read a book to them, say, okay, let me tell you about the saint. First they did this, and then they did this. See how good they are, and see how much better they are than you, and see how they, you know, were perfect and you're not. You know, don't do that, right? Take one story, share it, say, this really touched me. Did you hear the cynics are today? Did you hear this story about, you know, such and such thing? Did you know that blah, 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 blah happened to them? So let the things that move you will move them, and let it just come naturally and organically. And sometimes, you know, we can actually have the opposite effect when we focus too much on the idealistic qualities of the saints and not on their humanity. You know, like one of the beautiful things about Silent Patriarch, the book on Pope Kyrillos, is it just showed the pain, and it showed the humanity, and it showed the real, you know, the reality of the situation, how much he struggled, you know, and being persecuted by his own church.
And how much more of a powerful story it is.
Right. And
because you're telling the full truth.
Exactly. And then I can relate to that person, right? I felt that at school. I felt that at work. So don't also, you know, it can be a two-edged sword when we idolize either the saints or the clergy or the servants or anybody, because we're all people and we're all broken. And so tell all this, the whole story, you know, not just see how good they are, see how bad you are, you know, which is the typical. And then sometimes we have to look a little bit deeply. I remember, you know, growing up, the story of Mbep Shoy, you know, when he used to tie his hair to the top of his cell. And I still remember my Sunday school lesson about that story was, you see how much he prays? How much do you pray? You don't even want to pray for 5 minutes. He used to pray all night, and he would tie his hair, and you do 5 minutes and you're bored. You know, look how bad you are compared to him. And that was the lesson.
And it wasn't until I was like 40 years old that I figured out he tied his hair because he loved Jesus and he wanted to talk to him all night. And it's like two friends who haven't seen each other for years and they stay up all night talking, you know, and I'm sure he didn't have Red Bull. So he needed this to keep himself up, right? And you see kids, you know, at these college retreats, they're up all night and they can't keep their eyes open, but they don't want to go to sleep because they're talking.
Yeah.
That's his relationship with God. It's beautiful, right? So sometimes even depicting a story like that, you know, instead of riddling it with shame and guilt and saying, see how much better he is than you are, say, can you believe he just wanted to talk to God that long? What do you think he wanted to say to him? And just engage with the kids. I don't know what I would talk about with God for 10 hours. What do you think he talked about with God for 10 hours? And hear it, you know, and be human about it. You know? Be real.
Yeah, and I think that brings us back to the very beginning where you started us off with, it's really all about God. And it's all about communicating who God is and his nature and his goodness. And for us to really rest in that first before we do any of the work, you know, as we kind of wrap up our conversation today, how do we make that faith real and active, you know, not just in the struggles, but helping our children see God as a part of everyday life?
You know, there's lots of these little practices, you know, we can adopt, and you can, you know, go on the internet and find a couple of, you know, things to make God. And there's a book by Father Anthony Canieres, Making God Real in the Christian Home and the Orthodox Home. And he's 2 books, 2 volumes, and it's full. I highly recommend these books, full of these little traditions and rituals and little things you can do in the home to connect the church and the house, right? So that it's more seamless, you know, and just little things like candles and icons and prayer and just mentioning God all the time in the home. I think those are the key. And every parent has their own way, because based on what they like. Some people really like hymns and they just play hymns in the house or spiritual songs in the house, or just quote Bible verses. But the key is to focus not just on what you like. Again, you know, we're not just trying to make the kids like us, right? We want them to see God, you know? And so if it's like, I really like this, my kid's gonna really like this, then you have a problem, right? Because now it's ego. And so sometimes our ego gets in the way because our kid isn't expressing their spirituality the way I want them to express or the way I express my spirituality, you know? And you know, some kids really into singing, but some kid isn't. And some kids really into serving, and some kid isn't. And some kids really into helping others, some kid isn't. And so we can't force them down my path, right? Every kid has their own path, and we're all unique. And so don't, you know, it's your ego that pushes you to say, do it like this, you know? Find what they like, and then, you know, just like... you know, what Matthew said about Christ, he says, you know, a smoldering wick he will not quench. And he was quoting Isaiah. And I always think of that image, right? This little wick that's just barely hanging on. He doesn't quench it. You know, he covers it and he lets it, you know, just fire up itself. So each one of your kids is this little wick, and you got to cover it, and each wick is different. Find your own kid's thing and nourish that thing, help that thing to flourish, versus, no, I'm going to put this one out because you really need to light this thing over here, which is the way dad and uncle and your grandfather have done it, you know, and fall into that trap. So
I love that so much, and I think it speaks to how big God is, and to not have this narrow view of who he will be in our children's life. Obviously, you know, some core pieces of that need to be, but, you know, what that personal, unique, intimate relationship that will stand the test of time will be for our children. You know, as we wrap up our conversation today, Archie, which has been so meaningful and so rich, you know, I'm curious if there's one takeaway, if there's one last little point that you just want to make sure that anyone who is listening is really just taking away from this conversation, what would that be?
I would say it's the one of the things we say at Rediscover I Am on all of our merchandise is seek Christ, know Christ, be Christ. And I think that should be all our focus. You know, as parents, as siblings, as mothers and fathers, as spouses, that should just be it. So focus on those three things continuously. And then, God's the one who raises the kids, and God gives the answers. And in the end, we're all imperfect. And be patient with your imperfections. We're all messed up parents. We all, screwed up our kids in multiple ways, and wish we could take it back 1,000 times over.
Yeah.
Life is long. And maybe you don't have the 16-year-old kid you wanted or the 20-year-old kid you wanted, but you may have the 40-year-old kid that you may never see. And be okay with the fact that I may not be alive long enough to see my kid come back to God, but that's okay.
Thank you again so much, Archie. What a powerful note to end on. And we really do pray that this conversation is of benefit to anybody who's joining us. Please pray for this ministry, and we pray that if it is of benefit to you, please share and spread the word. We need your prayers first and foremost, and we pray for you, for your home, that God would meet you where you're at. And thank you again for joining us.